I am announcing today my candidacy for the presidency of the United States.
In the chaos surrounding World War II, how did one reporter gain the interest of John F. Kennedy, Adolf Hitler, and J. Edgar Hoover? A writer, actress, and accused spy, the story of Inga Arvad is one that isn't often taught in the history books. Nonetheless, it is an important one in trying to understand how small the world can be even during periods of great change. This fascinating woman caught the eye of some of the most important people of the 20th century, and how she did it provides valuable insight into their personalities and character.
The presidency is the most powerful office in the free world. Through its leadership can come a more vital life for all of our people.
Before his presidency, before the assassination, before he was elevated to a cultural icon that would define the American century, John F. Kennedy was just a man in love.
That means a date. Not like just going around with the crowd, just me and the girl.
This skinny kid from a wealthy family was still just a seed of the man who would become president. Jack Kennedy was taught to be a womanizer from a very young age. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy, engaged in numerous extramarital affairs and encouraged his sons to do the same.
Ambassador Joseph Kennedy has been joined by part of his family. Mrs. Kennedy has come from the United States with 5 of their 9 children. These are cameramen, not more children.
Early letters between a young JFK and his friends show that he had always been quite popular with the opposite sex, even if he likely embellished it at first. As a man of his era, JFK had a very misogynistic attitude towards women and saw them as objects to be conquered. Needless to say, this is a very outdated and problematic worldview, but it's an important piece of the puzzle when studying the Arvad affair. Kennedy's numerous affairs are well documented, from Hollywood starlet Marilyn Monroe to mob wife Judith Campbell. But there's one affair that stands above the rest, the woman who may have been the great love of Kennedy's life, who he would never be allowed to marry.
The Kennedys were married last month. They're still looking for a place to live in Washington.
Inga Arvad was born on October 6, 1913 in Copenhagen, Denmark. During her early life, her family would move around between England, Paris, and Brussels. By all accounts, Arvad is described as a beautiful, radiant woman with the intelligence and charm to back it up. She was crowned Miss Denmark in 1931 at just 16 years old and even competed in the Miss Europe pageant. The following year, she would get married to an Egyptian diplomat by the name of Kamal Abdel Nabi, though they would be divorced just 2 years later. In 1935, Inga married a Hungarian film director named Paul Fajos, and even went on to appear in a few of his films. When acting didn't work out, Arvad moved on to journalism, becoming a correspondent for Denmark's largest newspaper, whose name I'm not even going to try to pronounce. The couple would travel the world together, visiting China and Southeast Asia before permanently relocating to the United States in February of 1940. By June of 1941, Miss Arvad had graduated from Columbia University's School of Journalism and moved to Washington, D.C. to work for the isolationist newspaper, the Washington Times-Herald. It's here that Inga would have her introduction to the Kennedy family through Jack's younger sister Kathleen, who often went by the nickname Kick. Out of the 9 Kennedy siblings, Jack always had a special closeness with his sister. It mattered a lot to him whether or not she approved of his romantic partners, and she would often set him up with her friends. Inga and Kick became close while working at the paper, and it didn't take long for Kick to realize her new friend was the perfect match for her brother. But the question is, who was her brother?
Senator Kennedy, could I ask you a few questions?
Oh yes, surely, girls. If you'll excuse me.
John F. Kennedy may have been a future president, but that wasn't clear to anybody at the time, especially Kennedy himself. At this point in his life, the young JFK was still deciding between pursuing a career as a journalist, intellectual, or politician. When we talk about historical figures, our first instinct is to imagine them as we know them best, at the height of their power and influence. This sort of thinking dehumanizes historical figures and creates an unnecessary separation between us and them.
Bye, Rosie. Come on, Dad. That's enough.
For the sake of this video, I ask that you set aside your image of JFK as the leader of the free world and instead think of him as just Jack, the rich man's son and recent Harvard graduate with a love for history, politics, and womanizing. Nothing in history has ever been preordained, so come along with me for a few minutes as we try to forget how this story ends.
John Kennedy, on the other hand,
was quite a shy person, really. It was not easy for him to get out and shake hands and the rest. He did it very well. It wasn't easy for him. He was a quite private person.
It's important to understand why Kennedy and Arvad were so drawn to each other in the first place. The pair shared not only an interest in international affairs, but also on-the-ground experience in countless countries across the globe. As a child, JFK had been an avid reader with a fascination for history and government. He struggled with various health problems that would see him be constantly hospitalized throughout his youth, which only gave him more time to read. Kennedy was able to explore his interests further when his father was appointed British ambassador by Franklin Roosevelt. Not only did this give Jack a first-hand look at diplomacy in action, it gave him the permission to see the world in a way that almost no one else could. In 1937, this energetic college student was able to spend a summer driving across the European continent just before it fell under the curtain of war. His father's political connections even allowed Kennedy to be one of the last Americans to enter Nazi Germany without guns and ammunition. For a young person passionate about international affairs, this had been everything. The Kennedy who returned to Harvard after that trip was a different man from the one who left. Everyone was debating isolationism versus war, but Kennedy was the only one who saw the situation firsthand. Fast forward a few years, and the recently graduated Kennedy is now working in the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington, D.C. This is where our two lovers finally cross paths. Also living in DC at the time was Kit Kennedy and her friend Inga. Here's this beautiful, intelligent young woman who doesn't just match JFK's knowledge of foreign affairs, in a lot of ways she actually surpasses it. Inga was worldly, clever, and beautiful. Soon, her and Jack fell in love and started a very intense romance. During their time together, the young JFK would refer to her affectionately as Inga Binga.
Break it up, soldier. Furlough's over. And sister, don't be downhearted. My guess is he'll be back for more GI fun the very first chance he gets.
In a letter to Kik, Inga wrote,
"Tell young Kennedy that I got his letter, that it was the longest he ever wrote, that I'm saving it for my great-grandchildren, whom I hope will look like him, to see what a man he is. Tell him I smiled many times over all his political views, that he hasn't changed a bit, and I hope to God he never will."
The Kennedy family, of course, did not approve of the relationship. Inga was 5 years older than Jack, and she had already been married twice. As a womanizer himself, Joe Kennedy thought that Inga was suitable for a casual relationship, but eventually he became concerned by how serious it was getting. While Jack had dated countless women in his life, the intensity of the Arvad affair was a first. Inga had been married twice, and Jack was a Catholic considering a future in elected office. Any further pursuit of a life with Arvad would mean going against his family, his faith, and his potential career. But was there something else that made Inga particularly dangerous, even warranting an entire FBI investigation into her? This is the part of the video that you all came to see.
You may think you can trust the person you're talking to. A close relation, a lifelong friend, but you never know whether he or she will pass it on.
Earlier in the video, I mentioned Inga's work with a Danish newspaper. What I didn't mention, however, was the kind of reporting that Miss Arvad was doing. During her time with the paper, Inga visited Germany on multiple occasions to interview high-ranking members of the Nazi Party, including even Adolf Hitler himself. These weren't political interviews, they were puff pieces that talked about things like their favorite foods and their daily activities. In hindsight, this sounds insane. Imagine asking Adolf Hitler about his favorite food. Arvad lived up to her reputation as a charmer, with Hitler describing her as the perfect Nordic beauty. He was so captivated by her that he even invited her to his private box at the 1936 Olympics, where this photo was taken, a picture that would go on to haunt Arvad in the coming years. So it goes without saying, this is a bad look.
The problem now is future peace. That is your job in Germany.
It's important to note that Inga only ever wrote society pieces about Hitler and that she never endorses politics in any way, shape, or form. Regardless, it's very uncomfortable to hear someone say such kind words about Hitler. As human beings, we tend to apply significant hindsight to the past when the course of history was far from certain. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain is infamous today for his failed appeasement policy towards Hitler and the Nazis, which failed to prevent the Second World War. Take a look at this newsreel from 1938 covering Chamberlain's second state visit to Nazi Germany.
So we still say honor to Mr. Chamberlain through all the doubts and aspersions of these latter days. The man who stands firm for peace deserves the trust and support of his countrymen.
European peace is what I am aiming at, and I hope that this journey may open the way to get it.
When Mr. Chamberlain left on his journey to Gettysburg, he flew in the face of criticism that he was truckling to Hitler. That is one of those charges which there is no opportunity of answering until the full sequel is known. Hitler, of course, is the idol of his country. He it is who has restored Germany's power and pride. But in millions of German hearts, Mr. Chamberlain represents the man who wants to preserve peace. And not all the propaganda in the world can disguise that fact.
The way that they're talking is surreal from a modern perspective, but that's why it's so important to pay attention to. Joe Kennedy Sr., as British ambassador, was a very close ally to Chamberlain and a huge supporter of the appeasement policy, the issue that would become the political downfall of both men. Adolf Hitler was a monster, and if you're denying that, you're simply denying history. His name has become synonymous with evil, and for good reason. And while Miss Arvad's comments are certainly alarming, they attest to the fact that history happens in real time. These are human beings we're talking about, not forces of nature. The fact that so many people beyond just Inga Arvad fell under Hitler's spell is an uncomfortable truth, but it's still the truth regardless.
Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Briefcase, revolver, and coveted badge.
You might think that with the war officially underway, JFK might try to distance himself from Inga to save face, but you would be wrong. Soon, her phone was tapped and her apartment was bugged. During their surveillance of Miss Arvad, the FBI quickly discovered an affair between Inga Arvad and a skinny young man known only as Jack. As we all know, this would turn out to be no other than John F. Kennedy. It's very well possible that old Joe Kennedy had a role in Jack's transfer, as the patriarch grew concerned about how the relationship might affect the family's political prospects. The elder Kennedy put his foot down and told Jack to break it off, but Jack didn't listen. JFK soon found himself transferred to a naval base in Charleston, South Carolina, though him and Inga would still see each other as often as they possibly could. During this time, the FBI would regularly listen in on the couple being intimate with each other. This is the part of the video where I have to note the ridiculousness of the FBI listening to a future president fooling around with his suspected Nazi girlfriend. It must have been pretty awkward when JFK became president and Hoover was still the director of the FBI. This period also features numerous conversations where Inga expresses her desire to leave her husband and marry Jack, but Jack remains aloof and non-committal.
I'd like to ask you how in the world we ever got ourselves into this mess.
This is where the couple ultimately decides to break up, but not without going back and forth on the decision in the coming weeks. Inga had been estranged from her second husband, and he was even aware of the affair between her and Kennedy. We actually have access to a transcript of a conversation between Jack and Inga about her upcoming divorce thanks to the people over at the FBI.
I know that I will never go back to him.
I just wanted to be sure that this is what you want to do. From what you said, I didn't have anything to do with you getting the divorce.
You pushed the last stone under my foot, but that doesn't hold you responsible for anything. Meeting you 2.5 months ago was the chief thing that made up my mind. As far as I'm concerned, you don't exist anymore. That's how I felt an hour ago. I still love you as much as always and always will, but you don't figure in my plans whatsoever.
Okay.
You know what I mean.
Yes.
As the romance started to die down, Jack found himself transferred to the Pacific theater of the war. He wrote a very personal letter to Inga Arvad where he ponders the war he finds himself engaged in and its consequences on the men fighting in it. I thought it would be appropriate to read small portions of the letter here to provide insight into the relationship and Kennedy's experience in the war. In the letter, JFK refers to the Japanese by a slur that I don't feel comfortable repeating, which I will be replacing with simply the word Japanese, though the word will still appear on screen to preserve the original language and all of its faults and prejudice.
Dear Binga, the war goes slowly here, slower than you can ever imagine from reading the papers at home. The war is a dirty business. It's very easy to talk about the war and beating the Japanese if it takes years and 1 million men, but anyone who talks like that should consider well his words. We get so used to talking about billions of dollars and millions of soldiers that thousands of casualties sound like drops in the bucket. But if those thousands want to live as much as the 10 I saw, the people deciding the whys and wherefores had better make mighty sure that all this effort is headed for some definite goal, and that when we reach that goal, we may say it was worth it. For if it isn't, the whole thing will turn to ashes, and we will face great trouble in the years to come after the war. Inga Binga, I'll be glad to see you again. I'm tired now. We were riding every night and the sleeping is tough in the daytime, but I've been told they are sending some of us home to form a new squadron in a couple of months. I've had a great time here, everything considered, but I'll be just as glad to get away from it for a while. I used to have the feeling that no matter what happened, I'd get through. It's a funny thing that as long as you have that feeling, you seem to get through. I've lost that feeling lately, but as a matter of fact, I don't feel badly about it. If anything happens to me, I have this knowledge that if I had lived to be 100, I could only have improved the quantity of my life, not the quality. This sounds gloomy as hell, I'll cut it. You are the only person I'm saying it to. As a matter of fact, knowing you has been the brightest point in an already bright 26 years. This letter points to Jack Kennedy's unique insight and thoughtfulness about world events and how powerful that can be when combined with first-hand experience. Him and Inga may have shared a unique insight into international affairs prior to the outbreak of war, but now Jack had lived through the war firsthand in a way that many men of his status wouldn't. John F. Kennedy may have sought to rekindle their romance after the war, but Inga's life had moved on. She had moved to Los Angeles and started a new life as a gossip columnist. At this point, the FBI investigation had found no evidence of any wrongdoing on Arvad's part, and they officially ended their surveillance of her. In a letter dated November 10th, 1943, Inga wrote to Jack,
"You are right here with me. Unfortunately not in person. But the other day, my things arrived from New York, and grinning at me was the first thing I saw, an old picture of you, which we use in my Washington column. I counted the teeth. There were so many, and I am sunk when I look at it too long. I don't know quite what to write you, Jack dear, because if I follow my heart as an old poet, it will be a love letter, and if I don't, it will be stiff. But you know me. I know you will be home soon. And you do know, on pins and needles, that you are the person in this world I would rather see than anybody. Or is that a little bit too much of an admission? Anyway, I don't think this letter will reach you, so I fill it up with a lot of stuff. Just this home soon, darling, and all my love."
Inga would eventually marry American actor Tim McCoy, with whom she started a family and lived out the rest of her life. As for JFK, I think you know how that story ends. I know this video has been pretty scandalous, but I want to emphasize the human element of it. The real people that make up our history, knowing they're not so different from us after all. Hey everyone, this is Andre from the editing bay. I wasn't really sure how I wanted to close out this video, and I ended up leaving it to the last minute, and now my camera decided to stop working, so I'm coming at you from my iPhone. I tried a lot of new things in this video that I had been thinking about for a really long time, and I'm really happy with the way that it came out. If you enjoyed it, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel and letting me know what you want to see next. All of your support is really, really appreciated, and I'll see you next time.